Picture your typical morning routine. You open the refrigerator door, grab a carton of cold milk, and maybe pull out some bacon to toss into the frying pan. It is a mundane, totally forgettable moment. We take it for granted that fresh food is just sitting there, suspended in time, waiting for us. But I want you to mentally erase that refrigerator. In fact, let's rewind the clock back to the 1850s, to a bustling city like New York or Chicago. If you wanted fresh milk back then, you weren't getting a pristine white liquid from a pastoral farm. You were likely drinking something thin, slightly blue, and laced with plaster to hide its sickly color. If you wanted meat, it didn't come neatly wrapped on a styrofoam tray. The city itself had to be a giant, living, breathing, and incredibly foul-smelling farm, with thousands of pigs roaming the cobblestone streets, eating garbage just to survive. So, how did a city family actually get fresh food before the invention of refrigerated trucking in the 1940s? How did anyone survive an era where nature's clock was always ticking and food was always rotting? The answer involves a massive global empire of ice, a horrific dairy scandal, and a brilliant, self-taught mechanic who completely re-engineered the way human beings eat. To grasp the sheer scale of the nightmare our ancestors navigated, you have to completely dismantle your modern understanding of what a city is. Today, urban centers are places of concrete and digital commerce, completely separate from the agricultural world. But before the invention of the cold supply chain, that separation was biologically impossible. Time was the absolute, undisputed dictator of human survival. The moment a crop was pulled from the earth, or an animal was slaughtered, a biological countdown clock started ticking. In the mid-19th century, if a rapidly expanding metropolis like New York or Chicago wanted to eat, the city itself had to function as a colossal, unspeakably filthy farm. Imagine stepping into the sweltering heat of Manhattan in the 1840s. The first thing that would hit you wouldn't be the noise. It was the smell. It was a suffocating physical wall of stench. Because you couldn't keep meat cold over long distances, you couldn't raise cattle in vast green pastures and ship the beef in. It would rot into a toxic, maggot-infested hazard days before the wagons ever reached the city limits. The only logical, horrifying solution was to keep the food alive until the absolute last possible second. This meant that the streets of America's greatest cities became open-air transit corridors for livestock. Herds of terrified cattle and sheep were driven right down Broadway, dodging pedestrians and horse-drawn omnibuses on their way to local neighborhood butchers. And the sanitation department for all the rotting garbage generated by this system? That was handled by tens of thousands of feral pigs, which were legally allowed to roam freely, consuming the refuse and leaving behind mountains of their own waste. When you visited the local outdoor meat market, you weren't browsing pristine cuts under fluorescent lights. You bought meat that had likely been slaughtered that very morning, hanging in the open, humid air, covered in swarms of flies. You bought exactly what you could eat that day, maybe the next, because keeping it any longer meant risking your family's life. Yet, as chaotic and unsanitary as the meat situation was, it wasn't actually the most dangerous item on the urban menu. That dark, tragic honor belonged to fresh milk. Here is where the story takes a deeply sinister turn. Meat, at least, could be walked into the city on its own four legs. Milk was an entirely different logistical nightmare. It spoils incredibly fast, especially in the summer heat. And a dairy cow needs to be milked daily. To supply a booming population, dairy operators had to keep massive herds entirely within the city limits. But urban real estate was brutally expensive, leaving absolutely no room for grassy pastures. So, dairymen found a cost-effective, catastrophic loophole. They partnered with the massive urban whiskey and liquor distilleries. These distilleries produced thousands of gallons of boiling fermented grain mash, a highly acidic waste product left over from the alcohol extraction process, known as swill. Rather than pay to dispose of this waste, the distilleries built cramped, windowless, poorly ventilated wooden sheds directly attached to their brick factories. They rented this dark space out to dairymen, who packed thousands of cows shoulder to shoulder in stalls so tight the animals couldn't even turn around. They simply hooked them up to a continuous trough of this steaming, alcoholic slop. Cows are herbivores meant to eat grass, not boiling, fermented industrial waste. The swill completely ravaged their bodies. It was so highly acidic that it literally dissolved their teeth, making it impossible for them to chew solid food. They developed festering sores all over their bodies, their hooves rotted, and in the most extreme cases, the tips of their tails would necrotize and fall off. They stood knee-deep in their own manure, dying a slow, agonizing death. But right before they died, they were milked. The liquid these sick, dying animals produced barely resembled milk. It was a thin, sickly, translucent blue fluid, completely devoid of natural fats and nutrients, and teeming with deadly bacteria. But you can't sell blue milk to mothers looking to nourish their children. So, they essentially ran a chemical cover-up. They mixed in chalk, plaster of Paris, and magnesia to thicken the liquid and turn it white. They added molasses to mimic the natural sweetness of healthy milk, and in some cases, they even blended in raw eggs or the brains of slaughtered calves to recreate a creamy texture. They sold this toxic, adulterated concoction from horse-drawn carts throughout the city streets, proudly advertising it as pure country milk. The results were devastating. Mothers in cramped tenement buildings, desperate to feed their babies and completely unaware of the chemical horror hiding inside the glass bottles, were essentially feeding their children poison. During the height of what became known as the Swill Milk scandal in the 1850s, the infant mortality rates in New York City skyrocketed to horrifying levels. It is estimated that up to 8,000 infants and young children were dying every single year, struck down by severe diarrhea, tuberculosis, and cholera, directly linked to this tainted dairy supply. The system was fundamentally broken. The cities were growing too fast, the demand for food was accelerating, but the biological reality of rot held humanity in a brutal chokehold. People were dying simply because the distance between the farm and the city was too vast, and there was no way to artificially lower the temperature of their food. The pressure was mounting, and something eventually had to snap. The solution to this massive geographic disconnect finally emerged in the sprawling, blood-soaked stockyards of Chicago. A visionary and utterly ruthless meatpacker named Gustavus Swift looked at the incredibly inefficient system of shipping live, stressed cattle across the country and saw an empire waiting to be built. Swift realized a fundamental economic truth. If he could slaughter the animals in the Midwest and ship only the edible cuts of meat, the dressed beef, he would instantly eliminate the astronomical cost of transporting the heavy bones, hides, and waste. He could effectively undercut every single local butcher on the East Coast. The only obstacle standing in his way was heat. Swift certainly didn't invent the refrigerated railcar, but in the late 1870s, he perfected its use by hiring a brilliant engineer named Andrew Chase. Together, they designed a specialized train car that utilized the massive supply of natural ice Frederick Tudor's winter harvesting industry had created. They built heavily insulated V-shaped ice bunkers directly into the roof of the wooden train cars. As the massive blocks of natural ice slowly melted, the chilled air would sink, naturally circulating downward over the hanging sides of dressed beef, pushing the warmer air up and out through specialized vents in the floor. It was a brilliant, practical leap forward in engineering, and it single-handedly built the Chicago meatpacking monopoly. But here is the part most people completely miss when they think about this era of industrial triumph. These trains were not magically self-sustaining freezers. They were essentially just giant, rolling coolers on steel wheels. And just like the cheap plastic cooler you drag to the beach on a hot summer afternoon, the ice inside eventually melts. Keeping a train full of dead cows perfectly chilled all the way from the Midwest to New York was a terrifyingly fragile logistical tightrope. The railroad companies had to construct massive, dedicated icing stations at strategic points along the route. When a meat train pulled into one of these stations, an army of laborers would frantically scramble over the roofs of the cars, manually dropping thousands of pounds of fresh, heavy ice and rock salt into the bunkers to keep the interior temperature down. It was a constant, exhausting race against the sun. If a train was delayed by a broken rail in Ohio, or if a severe summer storm washed out a track in Pennsylvania, the ice simply melted. Within 48 hours, an entire fortune in premium beef would rot away inside those wooden cars before it ever saw the skyline of New York. But let's assume the train makes it on time. The heavy wooden doors swing open at a sprawling rail yard in the Bronx, and the meat inside is perfectly cold, fresh, and completely safe to eat. The journey still isn't over. In fact, this is where the logistics become incredibly intimate, because the railroad industry ran headfirst into what modern supply chain experts call the last-mile problem. A train can transport thousands of pounds of beef across a continent, but a locomotive cannot pull up to the front door of a crowded tenement building. How does a working-class mother in a cramped fourth-floor walk-up apartment actually keep that newly arrived meat and milk from spoiling once she buys it from the corner grocer? The answer was a heavy piece of furniture that defined an entire generation: the icebox. Before the hum of the electric refrigerator became the ubiquitous soundtrack of the American kitchen, families relied on heavy, ornate wooden cabinets lined with zinc, tin, and thick layers of cork insulation. They were essentially indoor vaults designed to trap the cold. But an icebox is absolutely useless without a steady, physical supply of ice. The cold didn't just appear with the flick of a switch. It had to be carried into your home by hand every single day. This daily necessity gave rise to one of the most grueling, iconic, and ultimately forgotten professions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries: the Iceman. Because ice was heavy and melted incredibly fast in the summer heat, you couldn't just stock up for the week. You needed a fresh block every single morning. To manage this massive logistical dance, urban families relied on a brilliantly simple visual system. Every morning, housewives would place a small, square cardboard sign in their street-facing window. The edges of the card were printed with the numbers 25, 50, 75, or 100. Whichever number was pointing straight up told the passing iceman exactly how many pounds of ice that specific household needed for the day. These men were the human engines of the early cold chain. They drove heavy, horse-drawn wagons filled with sawdust and ice blocks through the sweltering city streets. Using massive, razor-sharp iron tongs, they would hoist blocks of ice weighing up to 100 pounds onto their shoulders, protected only by a thick, wet leather pad. Imagine the sheer physical agony of trudging up 4, 5, or 6 flights of narrow, dark, unventilated tenement stairs in the dead of August, carrying a dripping 100-pound block of freezing water on your back. It was a back-breaking daily ritual built entirely on sheer human muscle. If you missed the Iceman, or if you simply couldn't afford the ice that day, your hard-earned meat would turn a sickening green, and your baby's milk would sour by dinner time. The urban family's diet, and quite literally their health, was entirely dependent on this localized, incredibly fragile network of melting water and brute force. Humanity had managed to create a massive continent-spanning band-aid for the problem of decay, but they were still essentially fighting the forces of nature with a melting shield. The railroad networks and the daily visits from the Iceman had fundamentally changed how cities fed themselves, but by the 1920s and 1930s, this massive, cumbersome system was slamming into a rigid technological wall. The world was changing rapidly. New highways were being paved, twisting out from the dense urban centers into the deep rural pockets of America. Transport companies desperately wanted to use motorized trucks for regional and local deliveries, completely bypassing the rigid schedules and fixed routes of the train yards. But there was a catastrophic flaw in this plan. You simply could not put heavy, waterlogged ice bunkers into motorized trucks. It was a logistical nightmare. Imagine taking a primitive, early-century commercial truck, already struggling with terrible suspension, and an underpowered engine, and loading it with thousands of pounds of literal frozen water. As the truck bounced and violently shook over the heavily potholed, uneven dirt roads of the 1930s, the massive ice blocks would smash together. The water would melt rapidly in the stifling summer heat, flooding the cargo bay, soaking the wooden floorboards, and rusting out the steel chassis from the inside out. Worse yet was the absolute unpredictability of the road. A train running on a dedicated steel track was relatively reliable, but a commercial truck in the 1930s was incredibly prone to mechanical failure. A blown tire, an overheated radiator, or a broken axle could leave a delivery driver stranded on the side of a rural highway for days. When that happened, the ice simply melted away, leaving the driver completely helpless as his valuable cargo slowly turned into a toxic biohazard. There are countless stories from this era of desperate truck drivers watching in horror as hundreds of pounds of raw poultry or expensive cuts of beef simply rotted away in the sweltering heat, the putrid smell attracting swarms of flies and wild scavengers. Blood and melted water would literally leak out of the wooden trailer doors and pool onto the dusty highways. The physical limitation of using melting ice to fight the decay of nature had reached its absolute breaking point. Humanity desperately needed a mechanical solution. We needed a machine that could generate cold on its own, independent of frozen lakes or massive blocks of harvested winter ice. And this monumental shift in human history, the breakthrough that would permanently sever our reliance on the natural freeze, did not emerge from a massive, well-funded corporate laboratory at General Electric or Ford. It came from the mind of one of the most brilliant, self-taught engineers of the 20th century, Frederick McKinley Jones. Born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1893, Jones faced an incredibly difficult early life. He was orphaned by the time he was 9 years old and was forced to drop out of school to survive on his own. But what Jones lacked in formal, institutional education, he made up for with a borderline supernatural, intuitive grasp of mechanics and electricity. By his teenage years, he was already taking apart cars and fixing engines. He eventually began building and driving his own race cars on the dirt tracks of the Midwest. When the movie industry transitioned from silent films to talkies, Jones single-handedly taught himself electronics and built state-of-the-art sound equipment for local theaters. He even built portable X-ray machines for doctors upon request. There was seemingly no machine that Fred Jones could not understand, deconstruct, and completely reinvent. By the late 1930s, this mechanical genius was working in Minneapolis, Minnesota, for a man named Joseph Numero, who ran a company that manufactured sound equipment for cinemas. The trajectory of the modern world changed forever on a sweltering afternoon in 1938, during a casual game of golf. Numero was playing around with a close friend named Harry Werner, who owned a major trucking company. Werner was incredibly frustrated and complaining bitterly about his business. He had just lost an entire truckload of raw poultry because the truck had broken down. The ice had melted in the summer heat, and the meat had spoiled right there on the side of the road, resulting in a massive financial loss. It was an unsolvable problem that plagued his entire industry. Listening to his friend vent, Numero reportedly made a casual, almost arrogant boast. He mentioned that he had a brilliant, eccentric mechanic working for him who could probably invent a refrigerator for his trucks. What started as a joke between two wealthy men on a golf course quickly became one of the most difficult engineering challenges of the era. Numero went back to his shop and tasked Fred Jones with the seemingly impossible. You have to understand that in 1938, mechanical refrigerators did exist, but they were massive, incredibly heavy, and filled with highly delicate copper tubing and sensitive compressors. They were designed to sit perfectly still in a quiet, undisturbed kitchen or a stationary warehouse. Taking one of these fragile, complex machines and strapping it to the outside of a heavily vibrating, violently bouncing truck, driving 50 miles an hour over unpaved roads, was considered engineering lunacy. Every single expert believed that the constant shocks and vibrations would instantly shatter the compressor lines and leak all the refrigerant gas, rendering the machine completely useless. But Frederick McKinley Jones was entirely unbothered by what traditional engineers considered impossible. He retreated into his workshop and began a relentless process of trial and error. Often using discarded parts he scavenged from junkyards, he began to design a completely new type of cooling system. His true genius was not just in the refrigeration itself, but in the structural engineering. He designed a heavy-duty, shock-proof automatic refrigeration unit that was incredibly compact. He strategically arranged the compressor and the motor so they could absorb the massive kinetic energy of a moving truck without fracturing. He built a self-contained mechanical ecosystem that mounted directly to the front of the trailer, pulling warm air out and continuously pumping freezing air back in. In 1940, Frederick McKinley Jones was officially awarded a patent for his groundbreaking invention. He and Numero formed a new company to manufacture these units, and they called it Thermo King. This singular, spectacular piece of machinery was the missing link that civilization had been desperately searching for. It meant that, for the first time in human history, the preservation of food no longer relied on the fragile, melting state of harvested ice. A truck equipped with Jones's invention could theoretically drive for a week straight through the blistering deserts of the American Southwest, and the cargo inside would remain at a perfect, mathematically sustained 34 degrees. With a mess of scavenged metal and sheer mechanical intuition, Frederick McKinley Jones literally stopped the biological clock on wheels. The moment Frederick McKinley Jones strapped that first successful Thermo King unit to the front of a commercial trailer, the entire localized architecture of human survival was rendered obsolete. It didn't just change how truck drivers did their jobs, it completely rewired the physical landscape of the American economy. Almost overnight, the grueling daily ritual of the Iceman vanished into the pages of history. Those heavy, ornate wooden iceboxes that had dominated urban kitchens for decades were unceremoniously dragged out to the curbs, quickly replaced by the gleaming, self-sustaining hum of the electric refrigerator. But the true ripple effects of this mechanical cold chain went far beyond the walls of the family kitchen. In fact, refrigerated trucking single-handedly gave birth to the modern suburban lifestyle. Think about the rigid logistics of daily life before the 1940s. Because you couldn't store perishables for more than a day or two, you had to live relatively close to a butcher, a baker, and a grocer. Urban density wasn't just a preference, it was a biological necessity. But once trucks could reliably deliver massive quantities of perfectly chilled meat and produce to centralized locations, And once families had their own electric refrigerators at home, the daily trip to the corner market was no longer required. You could now buy an entire week's worth of groceries in a single massive haul. This monumental shift paved the way for the invention of the colossal, brightly lit supermarket. And because you only needed to drive to the store once a week, families were suddenly free to move further away from the dense, noisy city centers. They began pushing out into the sprawling, newly built suburbs, completely untethered from the localized food networks that had defined human civilization for millennia. It felt like a total victory over the forces of nature. We had finally defeated the rot. But as the decades rolled on, this incredible triumph quietly mutated into something deeply unsettling. Today, we have engineered a global supply chain of such staggering complexity that it operates almost entirely out of sight, masking a profound and terrifying vulnerability. When you walk into a mega supermarket today, you are greeted by an overwhelming, perfectly curated illusion of perpetual abundance. You can buy crisp apples in April, fresh Atlantic salmon in the middle of a desert, and bright red strawberries in the dead of December. But that freshness is a highly engineered lie. The reality of our modern food system is that the average piece of fresh produce on an American dinner plate now travels roughly 1,500 miles from the farm to the fork. That vibrant red apple you just put in your cart was likely picked almost a year ago. It was immediately plunged into a state of artificial hibernation, stored in massive, football field-sized warehouses where the oxygen levels are mathematically suffocated, and the temperature is controlled down to the fraction of a degree to forcibly pause the natural decaying process. It is then loaded onto a refrigerated truck, burning massive amounts of diesel fuel to be hauled across the continent. We have constructed a colossal, energy-devouring machine just to keep our food in a perpetual state of biological undeath. And this is where the skepticism really sets in. We traded the localized, messy, and sometimes dangerous reality of the 19th century food market for a highly sterilized system that is incredibly fragile. Our entire civilization is now balanced on the razor's edge of this uninterrupted cold chain. We have completely lost the ability to feed ourselves on a local level. If a major economic collapse were to disrupt the global fuel supply, or if a catastrophic failure took down the power grid for an extended period, the modern city would essentially starve within a week. The sprawling supermarkets you rely on have less than 3 days of inventory on hand at any given moment. Without the constant roaring engines of thousands of refrigerated trucks hurtling down the highways, the illusion of abundance would evaporate instantly. We are living in a society that is highly advanced, yet fundamentally entirely dependent on a brittle, just-in-time logistics network that cannot afford even a momentary pause. We pride ourselves on the convenience of modern life, but we rarely stop to calculate the sheer environmental and economic trade-offs required to sustain it. We are burning millions of gallons of fossil fuels and releasing synthetic coolants into the atmosphere simply to maintain the hallucination that nature has no seasons. What we call fresh food is, in many cases, just preserved biological matter that has been chemically and thermally manipulated to look alive. We have built an incredible technological marvel, but in doing so, we have engineered a society that is fundamentally unequipped to survive if the machinery ever stops humming. The localized resilience of the past has been completely traded in for the fragile convenience of the present. Walk into your kitchen late at night, when the rest of the house is completely silent, and just listen for a moment. You will inevitably hear it, that low, steady, mechanical hum of your refrigerator vibrating in the corner. We treat it as invisible background noise, a completely mundane reality of domestic life that we never give a second thought. But that quiet vibration is actually the defining soundtrack of modern civilization. It is the literal sound of a machine actively fighting back the natural laws of decay. In our relentless, centuries-long quest to defeat rot, to guarantee that a mother would never again have to feed her child blue, poisoned swill milk, and that a family would never have to gamble their lives on spoiled meat, we achieved something genuinely miraculous. We conquered time, and we conquered distance. But as with all massive technological victories, you have to ask what was quietly surrendered in the transaction. When we look back at the chaotic, foul-smelling, incredibly dangerous cities of the 1850s, we see a society that was desperately, violently chained to the biological clock. Their world was entirely dictated by the seasons, by the weather, and by the inescapable rhythm of the planet. Today, we have successfully severed that chain. We have engineered a reality of infinite, seamless convenience where summer fruits are perpetually available in the dead of winter, and meat is reduced to an endless, sterile commodity neatly wrapped in plastic, completely devoid of its living origins. We no longer possess the sensory understanding of where our sustenance actually comes from, or the sheer volume of fossil fuels and artificial coolants required to sustain its illusion of freshness. We have traded the brutal, localized vulnerability of the past for a comfortable, highly sterilized, and completely synthetic present. It leaves us standing in the middle of a brightly lit supermarket aisle with a profound dilemma. We have successfully beaten the natural process of decay, insulating ourselves from the harsh realities of the organic world. But when we cut ourselves off so completely from the messy, cyclical reality of life, death, and rot, what exactly is the true cost of this endless convenience? Have we simply mastered our environment? Or have we engineered a world so artificial that we are slowly losing our fundamental understanding of what it actually means to be sustained by the earth? If this deep dive into the hidden history of the things we take for granted made you look at your kitchen a little differently today, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This channel is entirely dedicated to unraveling the invisible threads that hold our modern world together. It takes a unique kind of curiosity to look past the illusion of everyday convenience and genuinely want to understand the small, seemingly mundane mechanical details that actually shaped the reality we live in right now. We appreciate that curiosity in you. Leave a comment below telling us what everyday modern miracle you want us to deconstruct next. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.